Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Professor Gerald Horne. He is the professor of history and African American studies at University of Houston, and the author. His latest is coming out in July, The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm looking forward to your new book. I remember when you were on last time, and like I say, I can't remember if it was in 2019 or 2018, but you had said that you were you basically had covered. In some ways, that book is the prequel to your the last book that we had you on for, which was, if I'm not mistaken. Gosh, I lost it, but it was like the apocalypse. We were full in the apocalypse, the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and that was in the 17th century. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about Juneteenth. I think people know maybe a little bit of what Juneteenth is about. That it marks a day, June 19th in 1865, when essentially the Emancipation Proclamation was read in, I think it was Galveston, Texas. Tell us more about just the basic facts of this holiday.
Yes, and first of all, the 16th century book is now out, so you give me your address, I'll send you a copy. But in any case, with regard to Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army shows up in Galveston, Texas, off the coast of Southeast Texas, not far distant from Houston, Texas, from where I'm now speaking. And according to the traditional story, tells the enslaved that they're free. Recall that the Civil War had ended in April 1865, a couple of months earlier. But even though I support the move, and of course, there's just been a bill introduced in Congress to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, and corporations like Twitter have stolen a march on Congress by granting their employees Juneteenth as a day off, and I support that wholeheartedly. But the story is actually a bit more complicated than that traditional narrative. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation, coming into effect in January 1863, did not necessarily apply to areas where the United States did not exercise effective sovereignty. And that certainly included Texas, a bulwark of the so-called Confederate States of America that seceded from the United States in 1861 in order to perpetuate slavery forevermore. And then secondly, there was this lingering feeling among slaveholders in Texas that if the Confederacy collapsed, Texas, which after all had been an independent country between 1836 and 1845, and only joined the Union in 1845 because it was under so much pressure from British abolitionists and other global abolitionist forces. And so if the Confederacy collapsed, Texas had this idea that it would rejoin Mexico, from which it had seceded in 1836 because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery in the 1820s under a president of African and indigenous origin, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. You may celebrate Cinco de Mayo here in the United States, which is a major holiday for people of Mexican origin, which marks a clash between Mexican forces and the French puppet forces under Maximilian. Maximilian, of course, had given a warm embrace to the Confederate States of America. And so the idea was for Texas to rejoin Mexico under Maximilian. But fortunately, what happened is that the Mexican people, in league with Black soldiers, I should add, including George Washington Williams, who was an early Black historian, collaborate to squash Maximilian, leading to his execution, putting paid to this diabolical idea of extending the lease on life of slavery that these Texas enslavers held dear. However, I should say that unpaid labor for Africans did not necessarily end magically in June 1865. It continued for some time. How long is unclear. And certainly a kind of neo-slavery arises to take its place, speaking of the convict lease system, whereby Black men in particular were arrested on a flimsy pretext and then leased en masse to the same plantation owners who supposedly had freed them on June 19th, 1865.
So if I hear you, your I guess ambivalence is a function of people misunderstanding exactly what happened at that moment, and that Texas was really this isn't about Texas pride, and it really isn't in many respects about a status change of sorts for Black and African slaves at that time.
Well, I'm not ambivalent at all. As noted about Juneteenth, I salute those who are pushing that as a national holiday. I particularly salute West Coast Longshore, which as we speak are shutting down ports from Seattle to San Diego in solidarity with Juneteenth, in solidarity with the idea that it should be a national holiday, and in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I'm only questioning the traditional interpretation, which I think makes rather simple and smoothed over a very complex and complicated history, and in some ways lets the enslavers off the hook, because independent Texas was a major slave trading force. Galveston was a major slave trading port.
Right.
That is to say that the Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Africa, with the kidnapped then brought to Galveston, oftentimes transshipped to Cuba. One of the reasons you have so many Black people in Cuba is because of the manic energy of these Texas slave traders. They would also ship Africans to Brazil. That is to say, the slave vessels would sail straight from Texas, from Galveston to, say, Angola, load up the ship with kidnapped Africans and take them across the South Atlantic to Brazil. And so a lot of that history gets sort of smoothed over when you just talk about, General Granger shows up and tells the Negroes they're free, and then they begin to celebrate.
Right. Well, now, so let me ask you this in terms of like the development of the marking of Juneteenth, as opposed to the, let's say, I don't know, the day that the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. Like, I mean, how, why? And I hear you that, like, the end of the process, as it were, and I don't know that we're, really fully completed this process, but the end of the process, at least in the context of the official Emancipation Proclamation, regardless of what what's happening on the ground per se, would have been in 1865 as opposed to 1863. But what does it mean to celebrate that day as opposed to the day of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, first of all, the train has left the station with regard to Juneteenth. I think it's too late to claw back that particular date, particularly since Congress is moving forward. Black organizations wholeheartedly endorse Juneteenth. It's marked, I believe, in 47 different states and in the District of Columbia. We expect Hawaii to join the 47 sooner rather than later. And so I think that the importance is having a day on which there is a solemn remembrance of the horrific nature of slavery, and then using that process to connect the horrors of the past with the carnage of the present, recently seen on the streets of Minneapolis, the streets of Atlanta, Staten Island, and too many other bloody sites, too numerous to mention. That's important. With regard to Emancipation Proclamation, you may know that many historians, particularly Black historians, have been revising their opinion, shall we say, of Emancipation Proclamation. This idea that it did not apply to areas over which the Lincoln government had jurisdiction, such as Maryland and other states that control slaves, but did not bolt into the Confederate States of America. So it did not apply to them, but it applied to states where they did not exercise meaningful sovereignty, such as Texas. That seems a bit slippery, too clever by half. And so I understand why people are reluctant to hang their hat on the Emancipation Proclamation.
And my understanding is that the first Juneteenth was actually celebrated the next year in 1966. Is that right? I mean, excuse me, 1866.
Well, sure. And as we speak in southeastern Texas, there are going to be many remembrances. I mean, it's a grassroots project. I mean, and I think this is how things should work. It's a project that came from the grassroots, that came from below, that is to say, from Black people themselves, and then it's adopted by others. It's adopted by Twitter. It's adopted by other corporations. It's adopted by states in the
Right.
District of Columbia, now introduced into Congress. And to me, that's a model of how we get a day off that's paid.
Right, right. But I mean, is it? I mean, I guess, and you know, and I guess a part of having, and part of the reason why I wanted to have a historian such as yourself on is, in some way, as that, and this is the most prominent I think Juneteenth has been, at least in my lifetime, and I think a lot of that is a function of what's going on in the streets right now, but we're the speed in which it's being subsumed by what you're talking about, the corporations, and 25% off on all furniture this Juneteenth. I mean, I don't know how far away we are from that. Seems to be, maybe it's just it's just the nature of our society today, but having it be interpreted properly and celebrated properly seems to be hugely important. And it's almost like, it's also, it's shocking that that it hasn't really occurred to the society at large to celebrate this, particularly. I mean, I've come to understand through, frankly, from your work and others, in looking into Reconstruction, much of what happened, much of the America that we live in today is formed in those, in really those years from 65 to, I guess, 75. I mean, the Reconstruction has at least set up a template for our civil society today. It's sort of, it's sort of shocking that we don't have anything to sort of commemorate and to make people consistently aware of it.
Well, if the 45th president were on the line, I'm sure he would intervene and say, as he said in the Wall Street Journal today, that actually the popularity of Juneteenth has a lot to do with himself. He says that when he decided to have this rally, this is going to take place in Tulsa tomorrow on June 20th. He originally was June 19th. He said he brought a lot of attention to this idea and helped to thrust it into the spotlight. And so you may want to give him a shout out or give him a pat on the back as a result of, say, the rooster helping to bring the sun into the sky in the morning, for example, by crowing. But in any case, you raise a very serious question as to the fact that slavery oftentimes goes unremarked in the United States of America. I remember in 2007, when Britain was marking the end of Britain's role in the African slave trade, 1807, the 200th anniversary in 2007. Then Prime Minister Tony Blair spoke, the Queen spoke. It was a big deal. It went totally unremarked in the United States of America, even though, of course, the United States of America was a major slave trading nation. It was even the recipient of many of the enslaved brought on English and British vessels. And I think there's a certain level of discomfort with slavery in this country because it tends to disrupt the immaculate conception theory of the creation of the United States, that creation myth that sees the creation in 1776 as being flawless and perfect. Of course, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize just recently for an essay in August 2019, marking what she said was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans, where she suggested that slavery had something to do with 1776. And of course, all hell broke loose. The establishment historians have begun to attack her in scurrilous terms and actually haven't stopped to this very day, which I think is unfortunate because, as many leading historians have said, our obligation to history is to frequently rewrite it and frequently reinterprets it because different generations oftentimes have different historical needs. And I think that that's what's happening today as we speak. A younger generation is looking for an interpretation of the past that helps them understand the present. And I think a lot of the past interpretations, they help to bolster a kind of liberal narrative, which put liberals in the forefront of the struggle, and I guess made them feel good about living in the United States, and it tended to downplay indigenous dispossession and tended to basically indicate that there were more people involved in the abolitionist movement than there actually were. And so now people are looking for an explanation for Trumpism. I mean, how did we reach the brink of catastrophe? How did we reach this precipice? And this sort of overdetermining of liberalism as being the motive driving force of the creation of the United States doesn't fit with Trumpism, who, as of today, we cannot say this force will be defeated on the first Tuesday in November. So I think that reality is crying out for new interpretations. And I think also that the Black community is crying out because the Black community is trying to explain this carnage in the streets, trying to explain this pornography of violence captured on tape that's leading to lynchings in public, with officers of the state nonchalantly executing this grisly task while staring into the camera as if they were taking a walk in the Sunday park.
Right. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, just to, because I really do feel, I mean, that I am personally, in terms of like my understanding of history has changed dramatically over the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I would say, based around the question of race in this country. I think I've said in the past, I think it's Carol Anderson's White Rage. I think sort of just was one of the pieces that came together for me to see that there's a real continuum here. I mean, and I think that's what you're suggesting, is that, you know, we need to reevaluate history to get a sense of exactly how we, our estimation as a society of what paths we took have been, do not jibe with where we have ended up on some level. And it suggests that maybe we didn't follow the map that we thought we followed. Do you think, with that said, do you think that there is a danger in looking at slavery as a binary? I mean, slavery is in and of itself is binary on some level, but the forces behind slavery, the societal context in which slavery is created, is not binary. In other words, that like you get the Emancipation Proclamation, then you get this it read in Texas. But if I remember correctly, the general who read it basically said, like, incidentally, not much is going to change. Like, you got to go work and you can't really get paid that much. And that those forces, just because we said slavery ends, those forces that constructed slavery continued on to construct other functions that in some way function in the same way that slavery did. Does that make sense?
Well, certainly convict lease system, which I've already made reference to, was a kind of neo-slavery. And I think there's always a danger when one seeks to reinterpret history, because the interpretation may not stand up. I mean, to give you an example, historians, whether they acknowledge it or not, they start off with a theory of the case. I mean, for example, I'm doing a book on Texas as we speak, which is why a lot of this material is fresh in my mind. And so part of my theory of the case was with regard to collaboration between the enslaved African population and the indigenous, particularly the Comanche. So when I'm going through documents, I'm taking notes on that. But then what kept popping up on my in the documents was the enslaved population collaborating with their masters to a degree against the indigenous population. Now, the way historians usually work, they stick with their theory of the case and they don't take notes on something that does not comport with their theory of the case. But I felt compelled, and I do feel compelled, to try to explain that what I consider to be a kind of anomaly, and it was an anomaly because the collaboration with the indigenous was much more prevalent, but the lack of collaboration, it seems to me, deserves an explanation. And I think that that's been part of the failing of the historical establishment, is that they have this theory of the case and they stick to it. And then I think that leads to misinterpretations. I mean, for example, Oregon in the 1850s, when it enters the Union, says no Negroes allowed, no slavery allowed. Now, the historians oftentimes say, oh, Oregon is anti-slavery. Well, yeah, but they also don't want any Negroes, period.
Right.
Free or slave. And it's the same with Georgia in 1733, when it becomes a settlement, a British settlement. It says no Negroes allowed, no slavery allowed. Now, the historians stick to the latter. Georgia comes into being as anti-slavery. So how do we explain this anomaly of it becoming a major slave state? Well, just refer to the fact that they said no Negroes allowed. So certainly there's a danger with interpreting and reinterpreting history, but I think those dangers can be avoided with certain kinds of clear methods.
Okay, so and I got to tell you, I'm super excited to check out the Dawning of the Apocalypse, your latest book, and we're going to have you on for that. But give me a sense of how do we celebrate, aside from with the hopes that next year, maybe in the years to come, folks will have the day off on Juneteenth. How do we celebrate? I mean, has there been any sort of concerted attempt? Was there in 1866? Was there were there means in which to specifically, I don't know, traditions or whatnot? I mean, in my own sort of sense of things, Passover as a holiday is to celebrate the emancipation of the Jews from Egypt, essentially, and we have very ritualistic things. But how, within the context of Juneteenth, are there other things that and if you were in charge, are there some that you would want us to adopt?
Well, it's just like the King holiday, which I think has been revisioned as a day for volunteer service, for service to humanity, by working in soup kitchens, by registering people to vote, and the like. With regard to Juneteenth, I think that historically it's been a day of solemn remembrance. It's been a day of reflection on how this catastrophe was unwound, speaking of slavery. And I would like to see an extension of that tradition. Once again, I think that if we are to ever understand these eruptions from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and in fact globally over the past 3 weeks, you really have to understand slavery. And once you begin to understand slavery, as Michelle Bachelet, the leader of the United Nations Human Rights Council, announced the other day when they had these hearings on, quote, systemic racism, unquote, in the United States of America, with the brother of George Floyd addressing the body in Geneva, Switzerland, Michelle Bachelet not only called, she's a former leader of Chile, as you know, the president, she not only called for a repairing of the torn fabric of Black American society and ultimately U.S. society by dedicated means of reparations, and she did not limit it to the United States. She also spoke about colonized Caribbean, colonized Africa, etc. And so I would like to see Juneteenth being a day for rededication to what Michelle Bachelet has already articulated. That is to say, helping us to understand this carnage in the streets and helping us to try to forestall a further eruption of carnage in the streets.
Gerald Horne, thank you so much for your time. We'll put a link to your newest book at majority.fm and look forward to having you on to discuss it.
Fantastic. And have your aides send me your your postal address, and I'll send you a copy.
I will do. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Professor.